The subject might seem odd for a Sunday morning sermon, but I think it's a subject which the Bible has much to say about. It's been on my mind for quite a while as I observe. One of my favorite hobbies is observing human behavior, human interaction. I love pondering why people have done the things they do or why people make the decisions they do with regard to the clothing they wear or what they do to their bodies or how they interact with people. And I just love observing human behavior, and as I see it play out online or through social media, it's become apparent to me that in America, at least what I've seen, we have a communication problem. People today, especially the younger crowd, but it's not limited to the younger crowd, there are people who are older in age as well that are more or less addicted to their iPhones and various electronic devices that kind of are inhibiting our ability to speak to one another and communicate our thoughts verbally. Spending the last week volunteering at a summer camp, surrounded mostly by teenagers, has only reinforced my concept, my belief that we don't really know how to talk to each other very well anymore. And as I mentioned before, I think the Bible does have a lot to say about this subject. How we interact with people in this life is very important. And God does have some things to say about that. I'm going to read an excerpt from a recent blog entry on Huffington Post. That's not my favorite source necessarily, but I do think this really articulates very well my beliefs and what I've observed about our inability to communicate in America today. Something has gone wrong, very wrong, and we have to fix it. We simply do not talk anymore. We text, we email, we post on Facebook, we tweet on Twitter, and it is destroying our ability to effectively communicate in our work relationships, in our marriages, in our dating life, in our relationships with our friends, kids, nieces and nephews, with our parents and our siblings. Continuing on, it says, we shout at the world loudly now without ever speaking a word. We vent without ever having spoken to a person. And that's what you see in comment sections on any political post you'll ever come across. People are hiding behind anonymity. It says, we vent without ever having spoken to a person or picked up the phone. We are cowards now, cowards all. We simply prefer to be anonymous. And we have managed to figure out how, after thousands of years as a human species, to avoid the precious and priceless art of conversation. And conversations must never be confused with communication. They are very different. I think this really articulates what's going on. We know how to express a portion of a thought through a picture we comment online, as I'm doing right here. I'm expressing a thought, but just using a meme, a picture to illustrate, rather than, a lot of people substitute this kind of thing for actual communication. Let me just share a picture and you'll know what I mean. Let me just give a 120 character or less tweet to try and sum up a complex political belief or position. Let me share my faith through simply a Facebook status. Those are ineffective. Perhaps there's nothing wrong with that being a part of our communication process, social media and the internet and things like that, but I think we're limited to just those mediums for communication. So when it comes down to it, when we meet people in person, which happens less and less because people are avoiding face-to-face interactions, but the result is we don't know how to talk. You have people that, a boy and a girl, they're interested and they text, but when they sit down face-to-face, it's awkward silence because we don't have anything to text about. I've seen it before with teenagers where they're boyfriend and girlfriend and, they're long distance and they get together and they spend the whole weekend sitting next to each other, texting to each other because they don't even know how to talk to each other. And so in this lesson, I just want to share a few scriptures from the Bible, a few lessons maybe we can take away that remind us it's important how we present ourselves in person, but also I want to emphasize too that just because we might be interacting with people through social media or through the medium of the computer or iPhone, the rules don't change. The golden rule still applies. Just because you're anonymously writing on a comment section and no one will really know who you are, That doesn't give you the freedom to suddenly stop acting like Christ or disregarding his laws regarding how we should treat other people. So first of all, I just want to address the fact that for effective communication from a biblical standpoint, I think we need to acknowledge that we don't know everything. And that's difficult, because if we don't know it, we can Google search it in 2 seconds and have the answer. So it's about as good as knowing everything. But we have to be humble enough to admit, I don't know everything. And this is why I think a lot of people don't actually communicate, or this is evidence of why people don't know how to communicate. You look at what's going on in some of the major cities around this country. Portland, Oregon, for example, my hometown. People are rioting. People are resorting to violence. They are destroying public property because they are upset about things. They don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to discuss. They don't know how to debate using their words, so they resort to violence and outbursts of anger. People simply don't know how to express their thoughts. And I think it would help in this process if we acknowledged, I might have something to learn. You know, in any given conversation, any given debate, any given discussion where there are 2 points of views, you have to be humble enough to admit, I might be wrong. I might be the one who is mistaken. And maybe I'm not entirely mistaken, but I might have something to learn. I might not be completely correct. Maybe you're not completely wrong, but you might not be completely correct. It starts with your attitude. Effective communication and conversation begins by having a humble attitude. And the Bible is just loaded with scriptures that reflect this need to be humble. Philippians chapter 2. I think it's a scripture you'll know after a couple of words as I read it, but in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, it says, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself." When I'm having a conversation with somebody, when I'm talking to somebody who has a different viewpoint, my mentality should be humility. My mind should be humble. I should acknowledge I might be able to learn something from this person. I might be wrong. At the very least, if I don't listen to them, I won't understand where they're coming from. I won't be able to try and interject my thoughts or try to clarify or help them understand my point of view if I don't understand where they're coming from. If you regard someone as more important than yourself, you will give preference to them. You will not try to continually cut them off or interrupt them or speak over them. You'll be humble enough to allow them the courtesy to talk, and you will listen. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 5, it simply says, God is opposed to the proud. It says we should be clothed with humility towards one another. Being a know-it-all is not consistent with being clothed with humility. Those are opposed to one another. You cannot be a know-it-all and be clothed in humility. It's hard to mix those two extremes. That's one thing I've learned as I've grown up. And some would think I'm grown up. I try not to be, but that's one thing I've learned. As a kid, you looked at grown-ups and thought they knew everything. Now, as a grown-up, I realize I'm still just a kid that doesn't know everything. Not a lot's changed. You don't just magically grow up and then learn everything and know everything and are correct about everything. You have to be humble enough to admit, I don't know it all. I could be wrong because I've been wrong in the past. I have needed to be corrected in the past. So when it comes to a current discussion, I could be wrong right now. I might have something to learn. This other person, if I truly look at them with humility and I respect them and I treat them as more important than myself, I will understand they might have something to teach me. At the end of the day, they might not. I'm not telling you to just accept anything anybody tells you because that's what it means to be humble. But I'm saying start with the premise, start with the attitude of I don't know it all. I might need what they're trying to explain to me. I might need that knowledge in my life. That could benefit me. And there's some good examples in the Bible as well. In Acts chapter 17, we think about the Christians or the disciples in Berea. And it says in Acts chapter 17 and verse 11, they were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica because they searched the scriptures on a daily basis to confirm what Paul was saying. But I want to take it back a step further. What made them more noble-minded is not just that they were checking the scriptures, it's that they were even willing to check the scriptures. They were willing to consider that their long-held traditions might not be wrong, might not be correct anymore. They were willing to hear this man Paul, who had come to them preaching the gospel of Christ, and consider, maybe he does have something to say. Maybe what he's teaching has some value to it. We will now go check the scriptures. We're not going to take your word for it, but we will go check the scriptures, because they were willing to first consider, we might be wrong. We might need to change. What he's saying might have some value to it. That's what made them noble-minded, is their humility, their willingness to acknowledge they might need to be taught something new or different from what they had always believed. They were willing to change their practices and beliefs. In Thessalonica, there was a little bit of success. There were a few Jews who were converted by the message of Paul, but for the most part in Thessalonica, they plugged their ears like many of the Jewish people did in the book of Acts. They simply would not even listen. They would not even consider the possibility that Paul was correct, that what Paul was teaching was actually the message and gospel from God. That's what made the Bereans so noble-minded. In Acts chapter 18, we go to the next chapter and we're introduced to a man named Apollos. In Acts chapter 18, this man, he was not a false teacher, and that's a label maybe we should use a little more caution with. Apollos was a mistaken teacher. A false teacher is someone that I think has a degree of knowingly and they refuse to be corrected. Apollos was a mistaken teacher. But what I admire about Apollos, and he was no spiritual lightweight, he was a very intelligent man. Notice how he's described in Acts chapter 18, beginning in verse 24. It says, "Now a certain Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, he was an eloquent man, and he came to Ephesus, and he was mighty in the scriptures." He was no lightweight. He knew the scriptures. So he was an intelligent man to begin with. But again, he shows some humility here, that he's willing to be taught, to consider what is spoken to him, and then to acknowledge that I have been wrong, what I have been taught is correct, and now I need to change my behavior, my practices, and my teaching. Verse 25, this man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, again saying that he's a very intelligent man. And being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Again, we observe that Apollos was willing to consider, let me listen to Priscilla and Aquila. They might be saying something I need to hear. I might be in the wrong. And because of his humility, he listened to their message, he was taught more accurately, and he continued to go about preaching and accomplishing incredible things to the glory of God, because it started with his humble attitude. He was teachable. He was willing to acknowledge, I might not know everything. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 2. This is a description of society today, sadly. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 2. Those people that say the Bible is outdated or doesn't apply to our culture have not read it. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 2. See if this sounds like many of the people you've encountered online. Possibly this has been you. As in my own experience, I've been this person before, and I try not to be this person. A fool does not delight in understanding, but only in revealing his own mind. A fool just wants to blab all day long. A fool just wants people to listen to him, but when it comes to somebody teaching the fool, he doesn't really, his interest isn't in learning, his interest isn't in growing. He already knows everything. He just wants people to listen to him. Don't be that fool. James chapter 1, be slow to speak, but quick to hear. In my experience, personally, and in my study on this subject, I've observed that those who are considered to be good conversationalists, they aren't really ones who talk a lot. The good conversationalists are the ones who are good listeners. This is a skill we need to develop, is listening. Again, we don't just take everybody at their word. We don't just believe everything anybody says to us. That's not what it means to be humble. Being humble means I acknowledge there's gaps in my learning. There are things I could be taught. I have been wrong in the past, so I am most likely at some point in the future going to be wrong again. And so I will listen to them, and I will give consideration. Again, the Bereans are the perfect example. They were humble enough to consider and listen to what Paul had to say, but they went and did their fact-checking as well. They searched the Scriptures. So be humble. It starts with your attitude about yourself, but then it turns into an attitude towards others. In Mark chapter 3 and verse 18, we get a list of the 12 apostles. The original 12, that is before Judas took his own life. And you'll notice that among that list and other lists, among the original 12 apostles, you have got a tax collector in the person of Matthew, or Levi as he's otherwise known. And you have got Simon, who was a zealot. Now, historically, the zealots were violent, fanatical, bordering on what we might refer to as, or label as, terrorists by today's standards. They were also referred to as dagger men. They would go in crowds and have a dagger hidden in their cloak, and in a large crowd, they would stab a Roman soldier and hide the dagger and walk away, and nobody would know what happened, and there'd be a bleeding and dying Roman soldier on the ground. The zealots were violently opposed to the Roman government and Roman rule over Israel. The tax collectors, they took money from their own people in Israel and gave it to Rome. They were in charge of collecting taxes for Rome. Can you see how these two groups would hate each other? One group, the zealots who were violently opposed to Roman rule, they would look at a tax collector like Matthew and say, "You are a sellout. You're taking money from your own brethren to give it to some foreign government." What we have here is the equivalent of a ultra-conservative right-wing Republican in the same company as a diehard super-liberal Democrat. That's oil and water. They don't mix in America today. How was it that we don't read about these two at each other's necks all the time? Perhaps it has something to do with what Jesus taught them in John chapter 13. And this is a lesson we need to learn. This is why people don't know how to talk to each other, because they allow things like politics, they allow things like worldly affairs to become their number one priority in life. And so anybody that doesn't hold those beliefs is now all of a sudden the enemy. Jesus said, love trumps all of that. Love should be above all of that. Love should be the characteristic that defines you. Love and concern for each and every person, regardless of who they are. It should not matter their political affiliations. You love them regardless. John chapter 13 and verse 31. It says, when therefore he had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified. Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him immediately. Little children, I am with you a little while longer. You shall seek me. And as I said to the Jews, I now say to you also, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. He says, this must be your defining characteristic. Christian, if you are a disciple of Christ, you simply cannot allow politics or worldly opinions to supersede the love that Christ expects of you to show to each and every person in this world. You simply cannot allow politics to become your religion. I've known too many people that were Republicans first and Christians second, or Democrat first and Christian second. That is how they were defined. That became their identity. And that's fine to have strong political beliefs. I have some pretty strong opinions too. I'd love to talk to you about it. But I'm not going to let it come at the expense of our relationship. I'm not going to let it taint how I treat you. I'm going to do my best to love you regardless of whether I think you're wrong politically or whether I think you agree with me politically. It's not going to become one of those, well, you're on the wrong side, so sorry, I can't be your friend anymore. He says, they will know you because love is the defining characteristic among my people. That is what sets us apart from the world. Do not ever allow politics or worldly opinions or matters of this life to supersede the love that God expects of you. And further on, Jesus taught about the golden rule. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. That's Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. We want others to listen when we speak. We want others to not interrupt us. We want them to really give consideration to our point of view, right? Because we're always right. Not really, but we need to give others that same consideration. So love should be our characteristic. Keep that in mind as we have conversations, as we interact with other people. Start with your attitude about yourself. Be humble and admit you could be wrong, but also acknowledge that each and every person in this world you meet is valuable to God, and therefore they are valuable to you, and you need to treat them. You need to love them as Christ has loved you. That means unfairly. Undeservedly. It's not about somebody deserving your love or kindness. That's just what's expected of us by Christ, who loved us while we were sinners and hostile against him. Thirdly, one suggestion as a reflection of biblical teaching on this subject is ask questions, but what I really mean by that is show genuine interest. You know, we don't really know how to talk to people because we're so self-focused, I think is part of the problem. You know, Proverbs chapter 18, a fool delights not in understanding, but just in expressing his own mind. We love the sound of our own voice. We love the way our opinions sound because we're correct about everything, but really we get too self-focused, and that's one of my big problems with social media. It can be a great thing, but Facebook becomes too much about me. It's too much me. What's going on in my life? What am I doing right now? I'm the star of my own show. Everybody stop what you're doing and watch me. We need to show a genuine interest in what's going on in the lives of other people. And a way to do that is by asking questions. I've got several scriptures up there. Let's just flip through a few of these in kind of quick order. But Jesus very frequently utilized questions as a means to drive the conversation and move the conversation in a meaningful direction. Matthew chapter 16. Jesus wasn't just giving a short, flippant answer to questions. He responded by asking questions because he was trying to get them to dig a little deeper, to search their own motives. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 13, I mean, Jesus could have just told his disciples, hey, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Christ. Okay, we're all good, you understand that? But he wanted them to really think about what that meant. So in Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, he asked them this question: who do people say that the Son of Man is? And that's an interesting question, but he's getting them to think. They're starting to think more broadly. Well, what are people saying about Jesus? Well, you know, some are saying that you're Elijah or you're one of the prophets. Some are saying you're the Christ, and some are saying this about you. And he says, okay, now in verse 15, okay, but who do you say that I am? See, this is causing them to dig a little deeper and think a little more, a little more deeply about what it means that he's the Christ. Other people think certain things, but it goes beyond that. And Peter comes up with a very beautiful and concise answer. You are the Messiah. You are the Christ. Right you are, Peter. Chapter 17 and verse 25. Jesus asks there in verse 25, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers? And again in verse 24, the question, they came to him and they asked him to collect there was a tax, and they came to Peter and said, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax? And he said, yes. And he came into the house, and Jesus again responded to him, Simon, what do you think about this? Think about this question. And he answers him from strangers, and Jesus said to him, consequently, the sons are exempt. But lest we give them offense, go to the sea, and he gets these 2 coins out of a fish. But again, this is an interesting way of approaching this question. What do you think, Peter? What do you think about the answer to this? Let me give you a hypothetical question, but in this question, you will find your answer. Jesus is trying to move the conversation into deeper waters here, not just giving a one-word answer. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 12. What do you think? Again, that's how Jesus started most of his questions. Well, what do you think? I'm not just going to give it to you free of charge. I'm going to make you work for it. I'm going to make you work for your answer. And so this is a way of showing genuine interest in the conversation. In Matthew 21, this is my absolute favorite. Matthew 21 and verse 25. They have this debate. Back in verse 23, by what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? And Jesus said, well, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you a question to answer your question. If you answer it honestly, you'll find the answer to the question you asked me. And so he tells them in verse 25, the baptism of John was from what source? From heaven or from men? And then they start reasoning amongst themselves, and they debate themselves, going back and forth, and they can't come up with an answer because they know, well, if we say from heaven, he will say to us, then why did you not believe him? But if we say from men, we fear the multitude, for they hold John to be a prophet. So they're not really being honest, are they? They're just afraid to give the wrong answer. And so Jesus is challenging them to become honest and to think about what all of this means. Verse 28. Verse 27. They don't answer him, and I just love Jesus. Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Then I won't give you my answer. Verse 28, but what do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he came to the first and said, son, go work today in the vineyard. And he answered and said, if I will, sir. And he will not go. And he gives a story about these 2 sons. And just again, you read these examples, and there are hundreds, literally hundreds of examples in the scripture where Jesus asked a question. You see what Jesus was doing here? He wasn't making himself the focus. He said, you guys already know some of these answers, but I want you to challenge yourself. I want you to be honest. I want you to look for these answers. And so when we're talking to people, we need to show a genuine interest, and sometimes this means asking questions, turning the conversation back towards them and showing them that I genuinely am interested in this dialogue. And so when we ask questions, we show that we are interested in what they're talking about, and they tend to respond and ask us questions. And, just some simple, basic, courtesies in this subject. In Acts chapter 3 and verse 4, when Peter was at the temple, and there's that man who is crippled from birth, it says in Acts chapter 3 and verse 4 that Peter fixed his gaze on him. I always thought that was an interesting detail to include. But it also made me wonder how many thousands of people every day walked by this crippled man without making eye contact. This probably meant the whole world to him that somebody even just acknowledged his existence. When we're talking to people, we need to acknowledge that they are valuable, that we genuinely care about them. We're genuinely interested in their lives, in their well-being, in their spiritual well-being. And so we do that by asking questions. We want to learn more about them. So we ask questions like Jesus did. Questions of a discovery type nature, to discover their motives, to learn more about them. We make eye contact. We look at them and we talk to them and we show them by our body language. You are important. I'm interested in what you are saying. I want to learn more about you, and I want to learn more about your perspective. They'll ask you about yours too. You'll get your turn to talk, but it starts again with this humble attitude where we show that we are genuinely interested. We should want to know about their beliefs. We should want to know about their experiences or their perspective. At the end of the day, they might not be accurate. They might not be right. We might conclude that, well, I think I'm going to hold on to my beliefs. I'm not convinced by what you're saying, but can you not see the benefit in learning about people? How much do you know about the Mormon Church? You might not be persuaded by the elders that come knocking at your door, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't talk to them and listen when they talk, if for no other reason than to learn where they're coming from. Can you not see how that will help you in later conversations or later interactions to understand where they're coming from. The Bible also says, Romans chapter 12 and verse 17, that we need to be all things to all people. Paul said to the Greek, I became as a Greek. Well, I think that means Paul had some understanding of the Greeks and their culture and their beliefs. The Bible also tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 22 that we need to respect what is right. Sorry, I'm getting it mixed up. 1 Corinthians 9 is where Paul says, I'm all things to all men. But it's Romans 12 and verse 17 that says we need to do what is honorable in the sight of all men. We need to respect what is honorable in the sight of all men. You know, for example, when you talk to someone who's of the Mormon church, you realize it might not be appropriate if they're in your home to ask, would you like a cup of coffee? You learn those things. You need to learn those things by talking to them. If you have a Muslim in your home, maybe you don't offer them alcohol. It's not a good idea anyway, from a biblical point of view, but you learn those cultural things. You learn those things about their belief or their faith so that you can respect what is right in their eyes and not offend them. So we need to be good listeners. We need to ask questions. We need to show a genuine interest. I am interested in you as a human being. I am interested in your perspective. I want to understand your beliefs. I want to understand why you practice things the way you practice them so that I know better, so that I understand, so that maybe I can come back better prepared to share with you my point of view. We need to be good listeners. We need to be straightforward and honest as well. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 37, I love the simplicity of this scripture here. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 37. We just need to be straightforward and honest when we're talking with people. And this is something that is lacking, and this is something that is definitely lacking when we communicate primarily through social media. A lot of times you see honesty and straightforwardness are just not there. It's hard to read somebody's emotions. It's hard to interpret if this is in a joking tone or if this is taking it too far, too serious. Do they mean this sincerely, or is this lighthearted? It's hard to understand those things. It's hard to understand the actual meaning when it's not face to face. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 37, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. And anything beyond these is of evil. I hope each and every one of you understands what that is teaching. That is pretty plain to me when I read it. Be straightforward. Don't be deceitful. Don't be misleading. Don't be underhanded. Don't have ulterior motives. Let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. And anything beyond this, anything beyond just simple, straightforward communication is of evil. It does not belong in the life of a Christian. We don't have ulterior motives. We don't talk to people, kind of making jokes about them to their face, but then trying to hide it and snickering about them because they don't get that we're making fun of them. We don't talk to people for those reasons. We are straightforward. We communicate plainly and openly. Nonverbal communication says plenty. A lot of communication can happen without words. If you don't believe me, go watch any of the old Mr. Bean shows. Communication can happen without using words. And so sometimes what we say might be the right thing, but how we say it, or our attitude, or maybe we have an ulterior motive or a different meaning behind it, that can change everything. In Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 12. Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 12, it says, a worthless person, a wicked man, goes about with crooked speech, winks his eyes, signals with his feet, points with his finger. It's underhanded, it's deceitful, it's not straightforward. And again, in Proverbs chapter 26, this is one that is all too common today. You know, it's one thing with your buddies to kind of joke a little bit here and there, but it is easy to let that become, carried too far. Proverbs 26 and verse 19. It says, verse 18, let me back up. Like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death, so is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, was I not joking? You ever heard that one? Again, for those people who say the Bible is just irrelevant today, you haven't read the Bible. Oh, I'm just kidding. Lighten up. I didn't really mean it like that. Why don't you just say what you actually mean so you don't have to clarify? That's what I mean by being straightforward. Our body language says a lot. So and a lot of these points overlap. The humility starts with an attitude about ourselves. The love starts with an understanding of God, and that because he loved us, we love others. We need to show a genuine interest, asking questions, wanting to learn more about them, and making eye contact and have the right body language, being straightforward so that we're not giving the wrong signals. I mean, this extends to all kinds of areas. The Bible says, you shall rise before those with gray hair, as a way of showing honor. Again, this shows give attention to them. Somebody's talking to you, and I'm watching the game. You're telling them, you're not important to me right now. I don't really care about you that much. We need to show respect, not just in the words we say, but also in the way we go about saying them, the body language. It talks about the wicked man who winks and, everything he says, you're just not sure. Did he really mean that as a compliment, or was that kind of a passive-aggressive, insult? He kind of says one thing and looks and kind of gives a wink like, yeah, you know what I mean. I didn't really mean that, and be straightforward. One final point. What should we talk about? What should be the topic of discussion? I say that what we should shoot for, what we should aim for is things that are spiritually beneficial, but I will say we can settle for things that at least are not spiritually detrimental. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29, I know for a fact that any of the Paschal kids, I could point at them and they could quote this from memory. But in Ephesians chapter 4, this is a good one to commit to memory. Let no unwholesome word, and think about wholesome foods. It's foods that promote health, things that promote soundness of body. So from a spiritual standpoint, only words that are good for you, definitely not words that are junk food that make you spiritually unhealthy. But it says, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, that it may give grace to those who hear. Now, that's a pretty high standard, but again, that's what we're going for. Not everything I talk about is going to benefit you spiritually. I love to talk about sports. I love to talk about Star Trek. I can talk about Star Trek all day long. About the new television show or about the new movies. Are they accurate? Here, I got to stop. But talk to me about politics, and then we'll talk about Star Trek. Come find me afterwards. We'll have some good conversations. So not everything I say is really going to make you walk away feeling more spiritually energized, but I try to incorporate spiritually encouraging words and words that edify into any conversation. And I definitely make it my goal to avoid saying things that will tear people down, words that will weigh you down spiritually, words that are not wholesome. That's foul language, that's foul humor, things that are just not appropriate for Christians to speak about. This is what we talk about. Try using encouraging words. Again, not every word you say, not every conversation you have will be about the Bible. That's just the way it is. But maybe make a bigger effort in your life to talk about the Bible. Maybe make more of an effort in your life to say something kind about somebody. Tell them, I see what you're doing. I see the work you're doing, and I appreciate it. Maybe no one else notices it, but I do, and I appreciate what you're doing. I saw you the other day doing this, and I really appreciate that. I saw you listened in for a few minutes while you were teaching the kids' Bible class in that room over there, and I thought you were doing a great job, and keep it up. I know you're going through a tough time. You want to get together and pray about it. I know things are rough for you right now. You want to read our Bible together, and I found a few scriptures that have helped me and encouraged me. Try to make an effort in your life to incorporate more spiritually encouraging dialogue with people. But at the very least, avoid things that are spiritually detrimental. That should not come out of a Christian's mouth. Filthy communication, filthy words, things of a filthy nature, worldly nature, should not escape from the lips of a Christian. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 8. But now you also put them all aside, anger, wrath, malice, slander, abusive speech from your mouth. Do not lie to one another. Again, there's that idea of being straightforward. Since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices and have put on the new self, who is being renewed into a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. And one final suggestion, work on this. I have been working on this since my mid-teenage years. And I've made a little progress, but I've got a lot more work to do. It doesn't come easy. This does not come easy, but work on this in your life. Think before you speak. Think before you type something onto Facebook. Think before you communicate. That doesn't come natural to many people. But I tell you what, this will spare you from a lot of awkward situations. This will spare you from a lot of hurt feelings. If you learn to think and filter what you say before you say it. Ask a few questions. Is it true? Again, as we just read in Colossians 3 and verse 8, do not lie to one another. Am I saying something that's truthful? Or am I just flattering them? Am I just lying to their face? Is it truthful? Is it kind? Is this something that's going to help them? Is it a word that will encourage them? Is this necessary? I'm going to finish with Proverbs chapter 11, verse 22. Sorry, that's a typo. Proverbs 25. Proverbs 25 and verse 11. Is what I'm about to say, is it necessary? Is it beneficial? Is it going to do some good? Proverbs 25 and verse 11, like apples of gold and settings of silver is a word spoken in right circumstances. Just ask those basic questions. Is what I'm saying truthful? Is it kind or is it hurtful? If it's hurtful, don't say it. Is it necessary? Is it going to add something to the people's lives who hear it? If not, I don't know. Maybe it's one of my favorite illustrations I ever heard in a sermon was the great cosmic dumpster. You get this thought in your mind and you're about to say it and you're like, no, that's really just a stupid thing to say. That's really a hurtful thing to say. I really shouldn't say it. Get rid of it, pull it out of your mind, throw it in that great cosmic dumpster, destroy it for all good. It's not beneficial. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary to say this? At the end of the day, we're going to sing number 811 in just a second. At the end of the day, we need to remember this above all else. Some people are not going to listen to you. Don't be that person that just doesn't listen to anybody. Be humble and listen to others. But some people are just, you're going to see them on a very destructive path and they won't listen to correction. You're going to see people that are just so brainwashed into believing something that you are convinced is false and they won't listen to you. There are some people that you cannot help. There are some people that you will not be able to change, and your life will be easier if you just accept that. And then you love them anyway. Romans 13 and verse 8, owe nothing to anyone except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Not everyone will listen to what you have to say, but you owe them your love because Christ loved you. So as we prepare to sing this invitation song, we offer this as a convenient opportunity. If you need prayers, need encouragement, need the love of Christ or his mercy or forgiveness of sins, need to learn more about the gospel, any of those requests, we invite you to make that known as we stand and sing.